pedant since its birth, Lana will quite happily lecture anyone for hours on the finer points of grammar, style, information, architecture, and content strategy. If only people will stand still long enough. Today, we'll be a captive audience while Lana explains how to build a documentation team from scratch. Please welcome Lana.
Thank you, David. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which I'm giving this talk today, and I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. I'd also like to acknowledge that this land, which I benefit from occupying, was stolen, and that sovereignty was never ceded by the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung of Kulin Nations. So generally speaking, I don't like to start talks by talking about myself. However, in this case, I think it's probably relevant to start by letting you know who I am, why I'm qualified to talk about this stuff, and why I'm here. So I've got multiple management degrees, including an MBA that I completed in 2019. So that means I've learned a whole lot of management theory. Perhaps more importantly, though, I've managed a number of different documentation teams throughout my career. So my first team started with 4 people and ended up with 13. My second team started with 2 people, including me, and ended up with 9. My third team was an open source community group, which was an elected position staffed entirely with volunteers. I can and I have given entire talks about management in open source situations, but I am not going to go into that level of detail here. Let's just say that that experience has definitely influenced my management style in many ways, mostly for the better. My fourth team was a tiny little Australian startup that started with me as the sole writer and grew to 2 before the company fell over. Finally, my fifth and current team at Timescale started with me as the sole writer for about 7 months and is now currently sitting at 3 with the intention of continuing to grow. And if you hear this talk and you are interested in coming to join us at Timescale, I'll have a link for you at the end where you can take a look at our current openings. So, as with technical documentation, when you are planning to start a docs team, you need to start with planning. This is important if you're a sole author, madly trying to convince management that you need help, or if you just got that phone call that says you can begin hiring. Even if you already have a team member or 2, it's not too late to take yourself through this planning process, because the information and insight that you get from the process will help as you continue to grow your team. Now, this quote is a little trite, but the sentiment is a good one. In essence, you don't want to be thinking of yourself as the head of a great and mighty team, beloved and feared in equal measure by your subordinates. It is important to think about your team as the people who enable you to do your best work. Remember that without your team, you are never going to be able to take a vacation. So the first thing I want to encourage you to do is to think about what kind of manager you want to be. This plays deeply, obviously, into your own personality and style, and it's really important that you're honest with yourself at this point. Don't set your team up in such a way that they need to come to you to ask for each work item if you're the kind of person who doesn't like being interrupted a lot, or if you work in a different time zone. Make sure that your team structure and processes work for you and for your management style. With that in mind, I like to think of my team less in terms of hierarchies and more in terms of Voltron. I am hoping there's a few 90s kids in the audience who remember how this works. The essence is, though, for those who are not familiar with the cartoon, the 4 explorers each formed a limb of the giant robot Voltron, with the 5th explorer forming the head. You all need to work together in equal parts, even though only one of you is the manager. In this kind of model, my team members know that they can come to me if they need assistance or guidance, but they also have their own part to play. And for the most part, they're able to work out what they need to do next without having to come back and ask me. This allows them to work on their own tasks at their own pace, and it also means I have the freedom and time to work deeply on my own tasks when I need to as well. This is especially important for distributed teams, where you might have people working during hours when you, and sometimes the rest of the team, are asleep. So, next, you need to start thinking about how you want to structure your team. Mostly, this comes down to what your business looks like. If you're writing documentation for multiple products, then you might want specialised writers for each product. Or you might consider working more on a services model, where writers are assigned to projects as they come up. That means probably that you need more generalists. You might also need to think a little larger than you expect at this stage. You might only have approval for one writer now, but what will things look like when you have approval for 5 or 10 or 20? How will people grow and change within your docs organisation? How will you assign writers to tasks? What happens if someone is sick or takes an extended vacation? How can you bring in specialists, such as information architects, technical editors or content strategists, and how will they fit into the team? How will your team work with, say, front-end developers or documentation engineers? And I'm going to come back to those topics. When you've had a think about the kind of leader you want to be and the basic structure you want your team to have, it's time to start looking at the people you need on your team. It's really important that you don't just hire clones of yourself. And I know that sounds really obvious, but you might actually be surprised at how hard that is to do. As an example, I give you 2 fictional potential technical writers. So as I read these out, I want you to think about who you would prefer to hire for a position. So Kim's references are spectacular. You got along well with her, and all her interviewers got along really well with her in the room as well. They all loved her. Kim recently completed her degree. She has no substantial experience in the field. Jane, on the other hand, has a history of being productive, and her references are excellent, but her interviews were just not as much fun as Kim's. Jane has held a similar position for 3 years. Intuitively, you might want to hire Kim, just because you got along so well with her, as did all the other interviewers, so she'd fit well into the team, right? But objectively, we actually have a lot less information about Kim than we do about Jane. In the context of hiring, you should probably hire Jane, but it could be a struggle to overcome that intuitive impression that Kim would just be a better fit. Our brains are wired to go for the intuitive answer, and we actually find making intuitive decisions a lot more natural. In a lot of ways, they're actually more comfortable for us. So they make us happier. You would probably feel better about hiring Kim, even if you realise in your brain that Jane is more likely to succeed. So another way to ensure you hire people who are not like yourself is to make sure you're reaching outside of your own networks. Personally, when I've been hiring for a position, I've had a lot of really good candidates come through the Write the Docs community. And it would be very tempting to only seek candidates through communities like that, because we know them, we know we're going to get highly qualified, really engaged candidates, and we sort of know their background a little bit. But think back before you joined this community or any other community that you're part of. You weren't any less great at what you did just because you weren't there. Communities can be prone to a certain level of groupthink. So if you grab candidates from wherever you can find them, grab them from all walks of life, all levels of background and ability, and all different kinds of communities, you'll get a more diverse team. So one of the major takeaways I had from my MBA Human Resources class was that interviews are the single worst way to find out what someone knows. Unfortunately, we are stuck with interviews, so we have to make the best of them. There are 2 main things you can do. Start by deciding what the overall interview process looks like. So screenings, panel interviews, writing tests, one-on-one interviews, all of that. And make sure it stays the same for every single person you interview for the position. If you discover that you want to change things as you're going through the process, that's fine. Do it for the next candidate, not for this one. Also, the second thing you need to do is to write down all the questions you want to ask and make a scorecard to mark people's responses against. Then you use exactly the same questions for every single candidate and exactly the same scorecard for every candidate. Consistency is the single most important thing you can do to make interviews useful and to make sure that we're not just wasting everyone's time, including your candidates. So now, I gave a version of this talk many, many years ago at an LCA, and that was when I was building team number 2. And I recently had a chance to revisit that talk, and in it, during the question and answer session, I struggled openly with the idea of hiring friends. If I'm honest, I still do struggle with the topic of hiring friends, but my thinking has come a long way since then, and I actually wanted to address the question again in a more formal way. I have been known to hire the same people on my teams 2 or even 3 different times across different teams, different companies. And it's actually great. You already know the people, you know how they work, you know their strengths and weaknesses, you know exactly what kind of team member they're going to be and how they're going to fit in. However, the flip side is they also know you. They know what to say to please you. They know how much or how little they need to do to be considered successful. And they know what they can get away with. Now, hiring your friends is the very definition of hiring clones of yourself. So I'm not saying don't ever hire your friends. That would be massively hypocritical of me. You just need to make sure you go in with your eyes open, I think. Make sure you make it very clear to others on the hiring panel or the people in your HR team that you know the person personally. And if you can, remove bias from your interview process as much as possible. So if you're supposed to be conducting an interview yourself, you could have a peer do it, or you could have someone silently sit in on the interview who doesn't participate but has your scorecard, has your questions, and is making notes and going along. And that way they're checking your responses, making sure that you're not marking them differently to other candidates. So, hopefully, by the time you've gone through a bunch of interviews, aside from being awfully sick of interviewing, you'll have a good idea of who you're going to hire. Here's where it's important, again, to rail a little bit against your intuition. You're not trying to pick friends to go down to the pub with. Hire the person that has the most relevant experience, that has the more appropriate qualifications, and was most able to demonstrate that they have the right skills, even if you didn't get along all that well with them. It will be really difficult to do, and it might feel like you're going against your gut, and we all hate doing that, but your animal brain is actually trying to trick you here, and you need to tell it to just keep down and back. So perhaps one of the scariest things you ever do as a manager is double the size of your team overnight. Hopefully, your first hire is someone who is going to be able to cope with your fledgling docs team. Hopefully you've managed to explain through the interview process sort of, what the situation is and what they're going to come up with. You really don't want them turning up on their first day and going, so where's everyone else? Or where's the processes? Those things don't exist yet. So make sure you've already addressed those issues before their first day. They know exactly what they're walking into. Before your new hire starts, put some time into writing a hiring plan for them. I like to use Google Docs, but any tool will work, just so that they can comment on it and you can interact with them a little bit through that. The hiring plan should explain what your part of the organisation does exactly, how you fit into the larger organisation, important people they need to speak to, software and other tools they need to make sure they can access, and probably a bunch of links out to other important reading and that kind of thing for them to complete in their first few days. I also like to specify some broad goals for the first week, first month, and first 3 months, just so that my new hires feel like they have a little bit of a plan and a little bit of direction for those early days. Don't make the goals too ambitious. I usually have things like understanding the documentation toolchain, installing and using the product they're going to be documenting, getting their first pull request, that kind of thing. Don't be surprised if you're as nervous on your new hire's first day as they are. I always am, every single time, especially with a brand new team. Don't let this mean that you crowd them, though. Send them an email ahead of their scheduled start time, preferably the night before, to an account that you know they have access to. That might be their personal email account. You don't need to say much. Just reintroduce yourself as their manager, welcome them aboard, give them any essential information they need, things like, how to get into the building and find their desk or how to sign into accounts. And also send them the hiring plan document you created for them. And give them a note. Just say, we'll go through it with you in the next day or two. This gives them something to read through and start digesting, even if they don't fully understand everything in it yet. It also gives them a really good list of names when they're first meeting people in the building. So then you can book a meeting with them late on their first day or in the morning of their second day, when you can start actually dumping reading material and that kind of thing on them a little bit more. One of the first things you're going to notice with your new hire is that all the things that you do, it's without thinking about them too much. There's things like checking your GitHub and chat notifications, light grooming of the backlog, that stuff that we just do all the time without even thinking about it, the way you pull out a pull request, the tags you use to organise and sort your work tasks, the way you reply to requests from internal and external contributors and readers, even just the things you check when you're editing. A whole lot of that stuff is probably kept in your head. And this is all because of the curse of knowledge. As writers, we're familiar with the idea that the more you know, the harder it is to explain something. And so you need to keep that in mind, that it happens with people management as well. Whenever you come up against one of those little things that you didn't realise that you did, write it down. Start with whatever tool you use for internal documentation, a wiki or a document that other people in your organisation can access, and later on you can consider turning it into something more formal. The most important thing is that your team members, as your team grows, can go and look that up and find out the answer to whatever questions they have without coming and bugging you personally. And you can think about this as planning for future you to have some time off. You don't want to be bugged by super urgent direct messages while you're sipping cocktails on a beach somewhere. While you're writing down all this stuff about processes, it's really easy to start thinking in terms of, well, let's just make it a rule that this gets done. Or, let's enforce this particular task. But that way lies madness, my friends. I'd like to give you a small anecdote from when I was a little girl. My mum, like many mums, had a very strict rule that her sewing scissors were only to be used for fabric, nothing else. Those scissors were nothing particularly special, but if I needed to cut something, anything, you can bet I was going for those scissors first, and that's because Mum had said no. If you make rules for the sake of making rules, you are just setting yourself up for disappointment. Save the rule-making for when you truly need it. That way, your team members won't feel like they're being micromanaged, and when you do make a hard and fast rule, it will actually be more meaningful and is more likely to stick. So, hiring the first person is the hardest bit, but the challenges you face will change dramatically as you go from a small team to a big team. Take it from me that trying to directly manage any more than 10 people is a bad idea. Personally, I prefer to stick to around 5 direct reports, if I possibly can. And I'd like to share a little bit of an embarrassing story about this from my first team. So I was managing about 13 people at the time. We were working in a physical office, and we had an evacuation alarm go off at about 8:30 in the morning. So I was on my way in, I was in the car park, I had not made it up to the office yet. So in the car park, the alarm goes off. I had no idea who was in the office yet and who was not. And I just went straight up the street, straight up to the evacuation point, and started madly texting everybody. So I'm just sending texts out, saying, are you in the office yet? I need you to get to the evacuation point, need to do a head count, all the rest. And it was only after we were allowed back in the building about an hour later that I realised I had forgotten someone. Now, it ended okay. It turned out she just hadn't gotten into the office yet. She was running a bit late that day. But that could have ended up with one of my team members trapped in a burning building. and I would have had no idea until it was too late. If you can't reliably remember every single one of your team members under pressure, you have too many direct reports. So, if you find yourself in this situation, you need to set up some groups. You can do this several ways, but one thing I would recommend is that you ensure the groups are porous. Make sure it's easy for people to move in and out of your different groups, and that all of your processes stay the same across groups. Also, make sure that you're keeping on top of culture and social issues. It's super important. So the leaders of each group should be your direct reports. Make sure you're meeting with your direct reports regularly, weekly if you can, but don't neglect the people who report to them. Make sure you keep yourself available to them, speak directly to them whenever you can, and when you speak directly to your reports, just do it on a slightly less frequent cadence, so fortnightly or monthly, or even once a quarter. Team leadership is actually a really good way for people who want to move into management to try out a low-stakes management role as well. And it's a great way for you to expand your management skills as well, because you're managing managers. And that brings me neatly to the next point, which is that you need to consider the career paths you are offering your team. I am very much in favour of providing 2 career tracks for my team. One for people who want to go into traditional leadership and people management roles, and one for people who want to grow into a technical role without taking on management tasks. So a technical career track in a docs organisation would typically lead up to roles like information architect, documentation engineer, or content strategist. And it's important to remember when you're talking about career tracks with your team members too, that not everyone is going to want to stay in a documentation team. You may lose team members to roles in engineering, project management, or marketing, and that's okay. You need to make sure you're helping your team members achieve the things that are right for them, even if it takes them out of your team. So I mentioned this topic briefly at the beginning of the talk, but I'd like to revisit the idea of team structure. So let's imagine that you have 5 writers and 3 main product lines. It's tempting to put 3 writers on your biggest product and then have the other 2 dedicated to the smaller ones. Now, this isn't necessarily a problem. Everyone talks to each other, we're sharing ideas, we're all using the same tools, and we can all come to each other for help. The problem arises when you have Alex working on product A over here, and they get sick or they quit, and someone else has to pick up that work. At that point, you realise that Alex had a bunch of product knowledge that no one else has. They've been attending product meetings, they've established relationships with developers, and they've been playing with the product for some time. And that's not something that someone else can easily step into at a moment's notice. So some of these things you can mitigate. You can mitigate them by implementing policies about frequent reporting, making sure all work, including drafts, is done in an open fashion, and recording meetings and meeting notes whenever possible. But product knowledge is hard won by your team members, and no amount of note-taking or policy making is going to mitigate that kind of knowledge loss. If you want to keep your dedicated writers, you absolutely can. Implement some job shadowing. This allows people to go and spend a few days or a week working on another product that has a dedicated writer on it. It doesn't fully resolve the problem, but at least you have someone else in the team has at least a little bit of that knowledge and can sort of pick up the threads if needed. The alternative, which I prefer, is to use a services model. This is where the documentation team acts as a consulting agency to engineering. So a docs request comes in, someone takes it. Product teams won't get the same writer every time, but work gets done by the next available writer. This means that deliverables won't fall through the cracks if writers take some time off. And best of all, when people leave your group, you don't lose an entire body of knowledge as well. So just in case it wasn't obvious, I live in Australia, which means that for most of my career, I've been living on the wrong side of the world. This means that I spend a whole lot more time thinking about time zones than most people. And if you're based in an office and all your team are with you in that same office, then time zones might not be something you need to think about a lot. But with more teams going remote and more companies like Timescale being globally remote, time zones are something that you need to be able to handle at some point. And it's actually really hard. As much as I preach a work ethic of making sure you're having downtime, not checking email on the weekends, that kind of thing, time zones mean sometimes you need to be working at a time when, let's face it, we'd rather be in bed. Sometimes you do need to take a virtual meeting at 7 a.m, and that's cool. Do it in your pajamas, have your coffee in hand, don't be afraid to yawn. It's important to be honest about the time zone you're working in, and it's also important that you don't need to say yes to everything. If you have a facility in your organisation where people can see your calendar and book meetings with you, you should be able to set availability. And I don't just mean 9 to 5. I have set availability in my morning and my evening, but I block out times around meals so I can spend that time with my family. So on top of personal considerations, you also need to consider where your team is located. If you have, say, everyone in the continental United States except one person who is in, say, Australia, that poor person in Australia is going to feel a little bit isolated. That doesn't mean you shouldn't hire people in a different time zone. It just means you need to put in that little bit of extra effort to make sure that they're included and that they're getting information. So let's talk about meetings. Probably the main thing that will drive home to you that you're a manager now is that you will be doing more meetings and a whole lot less actual work. So yes, you'll be doing all the meetings you did before, but now you'll also be doing a whole lot of one-on-one meetings with your staff, and they're the ones I want to talk about first. If you're anything like me, you'll come to a point where you feel like all the one-on-one meetings might actually kill you. I'm living proof that they won't. And I'm also going to tell you that you have to do them anyway. I'm sorry. One-on-one meetings are not actually there for your benefit. I mean, you will benefit from them, but that's not why they exist. It's not why we do them. Their primary purpose is to communicate to your team members that you care about them, that you care about what they're working on, and that you are, above all, listening to them. If you spend your one-on-one meetings doing all the talking, then you're doing it wrong. I like to remind my team members that they set the agenda for our one-on-one meetings. Whether or not they send me a formal agenda ahead of time, they don't have to. But what I like to do, every one-on-one meeting I have, I always start with a question such as, so, how has your week been? Or, what's going on? How are things for you? Let your team member talk about whatever is on their mind. Work tasks, how they're getting along with other colleagues, tool complaints, anything at all, even their personal life if that's what they want to talk about. You do not need to solve each problem as things come up, but you do need to be actively listening. And you need to find out if there's an action that they would like you to take. If they do ask you to do something, make sure you do it, take a note, make sure you report back to them in a timely manner, even if it's to say that you couldn't do it. But above all, make sure your team members feel heard. And that brings us to the dreaded team meeting. This is the meeting where you, as the manager, get to do all the talking. How you structure this is entirely up to you. I would recommend that you do at least some kind of an overview of what people have been working on since the last meeting and some kind of planning for what's coming up. I also like to make sure I have an open agenda so people can add their own things to the list for discussion. Basically, I use this meeting for calibrating the team on current events and what we're all, as a group, working towards and prioritising right now. But also, it's a way of me communicating to the entire team. I don't want to be communicating to individuals in their one-on-one unless it's specific to that person. So save the general announcements for the team meetings. But if you remember just one thing about meetings, then let it be this. Always praise in public and criticise in private. No backbiting or complaining in the team meeting, and save the advice for your one-on-ones. One thing I have seen a lot of people do is use their team meeting for sort of these passive-aggressive kind of comments like, and don't forget to use a meaningful commit message, that kind of thing. Save that for the one-on-ones with the people who actually need to hear it, the people who actually need a reminder. That That's for a few reasons. It will mean more if it's delivered personally, but it also gives people a chance to ask questions if they genuinely need help, rather than risking embarrassing themselves in a public forum. I do want to add that there are exceptions to this rule. It's usually for more serious matters like abuse or bullying, and so I'm just not going to cover those here. It's a completely different topic. But there are exceptions, is my point. The final note that I want to make about conducting team meetings is to check who has agency. Who is talking the most? Who is answering questions? Who is suggesting agenda items? Who is sitting in the corner not saying anything? Not everyone can or will want to speak up, and you absolutely should not make them, but at least make sure they have the opportunity to do so if they wish to. So I appreciate that at least some of this talk sounds like I live in a perfect world. And while timescale is pretty great, I also have to live here in the real world with all the rest of you. So this final part of my talk is about dealing with things when things aren't going so great. Hiring is hard, and it's also an incredibly imprecise science. So that means you're not going to get it right every time. Fortunately, most people will actually pretty quickly work out if they're not fitting in or if they're just not enjoying the work, and most will choose to move on all of their own volition. That's not always going to happen though, and sometimes you will need to intervene before things get toxic. Always start by having an open and honest conversation with the person involved. To prepare for that conversation, you need to start by talking to your own manager and possibly your HR department. Not because you necessarily want to fire your team member, but because you need to make sure you understand what you can and can't do in this situation and what the process is to get to that point. In some jurisdictions, that process can actually be really lengthy, and it can require a significant amount of preparation and very careful language. Additionally, your company might have specific rules and regulations that you need to follow as well. So once you've had that first conversation with your manager the first conversation with your team member, you might be pleasantly surprised. Many people just don't actually realise that what they're doing is disruptive or is otherwise unhelpful until you point it out, and many people are actually happy enough to try and make that change. No one wants to put their job in jeopardy, especially if they like the work. Unfortunately, though, that's not always the case. And in that situation, which hopefully is very rare, you will either need to encourage them to find a role more suited to them or go through the process to remove them entirely. Whatever happens, though, make sure you record everything, you remain polite, you work with your management and your HR team, and you continue to act in good faith. Remember to review all your practices afterwards as well. See if there's ways that you can improve. Team structure problems are in many ways easier to recover from. However, they're often harder to spot. It's entirely possible that you think your team structure is working well, while people on your team think that it is not. It's also possible that some people on your team love the way you're doing things and others don't, and it's sometimes for the same reason. The best advice I can give you on this is to keep talking to people. This is the type of conversation you want to be having in your one-on-ones, primarily. But don't be afraid to tweak things in your structure and try things out too. And you can use your team meetings for this to say, I've been thinking about trying this thing. What do you all think about that? That way your staff know that you're up for changing things and that you can take feedback on structure decisions as well. And I guess the addendum to that is to make sure that you admit when you make a mistake too. If you change something and it just doesn't hit, change it back. Sometimes you end up in a situation where just everything is terrible. This has happened to me when I've walked in as a new manager to an existing team. If the team has a terrible culture, bad work practices, and a rotten attitude, it's a really difficult ship to turn around. The key here, though, is culture. Encourage open communication, make sure you demonstrate trustworthiness, and engage your team members in the process of improving. It could take a long time, but I promise it will be absolutely worth the hard work. Finally, I'd like to end on a note from a dedicated leader and public servant. who tells us that the reason we do these things is because we get to work hard at work worth doing. Management isn't for everyone, but I personally love the challenge of leading people. For me, it's about taking the time to find out what makes an individual tick and how I can best put them in a place that satisfies them. Whether it's finding them work that they find meaningful, a team that they enjoy spending time with, or just a great atmosphere to rock up and work in each day. It's important to remember that what motivates people is more than just a paycheck. It's also about giving them meaningful work that they enjoy and that they can work hard and excel at. So, go and find your team and get to work. If you want to come work with me and my team, Timescale are hiring, mostly still all across the organisation, although we've scaled back a little bit recently, and we are globally remote. So please check out our careers page. You can scan the QR code or go to timescale.com/careers. And thank you. Thank you for listening. I really appreciate you spending the time. Do we have time for questions?
Thank you, Lana. Yes, we've got time. We've got 3 minutes for questions, which is maybe 2 questions or 3 micro questions. Or any questions? Yes. Speak.
Have you got any tips or advice for groups that are like our team, for instance, is more like technical engineers that are 10% technical documentation writers, for instance, that cover a few different service stacks, whereas I feel like most of the stuff you're talking about today are primarily technical or documentation writing roles. How do you find that change or shift in a team dynamic, and any advice?
Multidisciplinary teams are awesome, can I say, and I wish I'd had an opportunity to manage more of them. So I'm primarily going from my own experience here, which has been primarily documentation teams. I think management is a skill you can learn, and I don't think, at its most basic, I don't think it matters who you're managing, especially when we're talking about just technical people, generally technical people, right? I suspect if you're a good manager, you can probably manage just about anybody. I think with multidisciplinary teams, you've got more interesting questions about team structure and how we move between groups and how we assign work items and that kind of thing. They're sort of more practical, hands-on things. And I'm probably not the best person to advise you on that because I haven't managed that many multidisciplinary teams, although I am currently in one. So yeah, I probably don't have anything specific to tell you. All I would remind you is that a good management, especially of technical people, I think you can probably manage anybody. So work on those management skills and you'll get somewhere.
Thank you. Have we got any more questions? Going once, going twice. Thank you, Lana.